I need to qualify my status here. I'm not yet an officially announced candidate. And the reason is because in order to be an official candidate, I have to already be on unpaid leave, which I can do for 1 year. So I'm not going to be doing that until the very beginning of 2018. But I'm going to get around. And my main purpose for exploring the candidacy is to raise what I think are important issues that are not being discussed. I've been living in Athens since 1982. I've been to many meetings of our local Democratic Party. And never have I been to a meeting where there's been a discussion of what we stand for. And I want to contribute to such a discussion now because it's getting too late in the game to put off such discussions. And I think you'll see from the kind of bold proposals I want to put forward that what the parties in our country have been offering are not adequate to deal with the challenges we face, and that includes the Democratic Party. Now, to set the stage, I'd like to point to a problem that we are all facing, and I think we all are aware that the American dream is in great trouble. We, the nation that has accumulated the greatest wealth of any nation in human history, has become the most unequal developed nation on the planet, with the least social mobility. We can no longer tell to our younger generation that they can expect to do better than we elders have done. But there's looming ahead of us an even greater challenge. It is a challenge throughout the world, and that is the assault on the full-time job. Currently, in the world at large, only 25% of employment is in the form of a full-time, permanent job. Now, I think there's been a lot of talk in this country about how globalization and free trade policies that make it easy for firms to transfer their operations to wherever in the world they can find lower costs of production, lower wages, and so forth, that has led to job losses. Well, that has contributed to 15% of the job losses in manufacturing. But there are two other racing developments that are posing much greater threats to the full-time job. One is automation, and the other is the rise of the gig economy. Now, we in America have experienced the phenomenal advance of automation in agriculture, where a century ago, most of the population, almost all the population, supported itself through agriculture. Now our agricultural production is greater than ever, it's more valuable than ever, yet less than 1.5% of the population lives off agriculture. Manufacturing has undergone automation that has not yet reached the levels of those achieved in agriculture, but currently only 11% of the working population is engaged in manufacturing. And even though the level of manufacturing output and its value is increasing, employment has been falling, and 85% of the losses in manufacturing jobs are due to automation. Now, 86% of the population, including myself, and I'm sure many of you, work in the service sector. And it's now estimated in the next 2 decades that 50% of the jobs in the service sector are going to be succumbing to automation. Now, on top of that, there has been this phenomenal rise of the so-called gig economy, where due to technological advances and the political climate that gives employers license to do more or less as they please, and to the decline of the labor movement and growing disempowerment of employees, employers are taking advantage of all of this to exchange full-time employment for part-time, temporary employment, often using contract contingent, so-called contingent workers, freelancers, who may think of themselves as being entrepreneurs, enjoying a large degree of independence, but in truth, they are working piecework, supplying particular goods and services in isolation with no security, no benefits, no opportunity to join together with their fellow peace workers to better their situation. Now, already the gig economy is accounting for 34% of employment in this country, and this is something happening worldwide. In America, this poses perhaps the most catastrophic consequences, and this is because we are the one nation in the developed world which has failed to provide public guarantees of those resources we need to be able to exercise our family rights and responsibilities, our social opportunities, and our political involvements. Instead, if we have such things as decent health care, decent benefits, a genuine pension that one might be able to live on without succumbing to poverty, these all center around a full-time job. And this is not because of any special benevolence of American employers. It's rather because employees have fought tooth and nail for these benefits through their trade unions. But with the decline of the full-time job, not only are we facing a lack of income, but we're facing the loss of all of those benefits that have been tied to full-time employment. Now, what I want to put before you are some planks of what I think we can consider a new social bill of rights. And as you'll see, these proposals are not being advocated by any public officials, nor are they being advocated by any candidates, including Democratic candidates, including not just Hillary Clinton, but also Bernie Sanders. So I want you to think hard about these proposals. To some degree, they are anticipated by one of the great Democrats, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who in his 1944 inauguration called for a new economic Bill of Rights, where he pointed out that the American Constitution had failed to guarantee many of the things that we need in order to face the realities of a market economy in the modern world. And although he wasn't able to live long enough and to survive the Second World War and begin to implement any of these proposals, Eleanor Roosevelt chaired a committee in the new United Nations, and in 1948, under her advisement, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted. It was presented to the new United Nations, and of the countries that attended that meeting, all of them supported it, including the United States, with the exception of the Soviet Union and its communist satellites. The Union of South Africa, whose apartheid regime was in flagrant violation of that Declaration of Human Rights, and Saudi Arabia, whose religious intolerance and oppression of women also made them unable to support the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Well, it's now 60 years since the adoption of that declaration, and I have to say that we are still in flagrant violation of it. If you look at that declaration, you will see that it does contain a social bill of rights that we, I think, very much need to think of making a reality. Now, the keystone of such a social bill of rights is the recognition and enforcement of the true right to work. Not the bogus right to work, not the phony right to work that all southern states have adopted, and now more and more states, which basically limit the opportunities of trade unions to support themselves, prohibit public employees from being able to engage in collective bargaining. No, the true right to work involves guaranteeing all willing and able adults the opportunity to have a job at a living wage with which they can support themselves and their dependents. Now, the right to work cannot be realized and guaranteed by relying on the workings of the market. There are always winners and losers in the struggle for competition, and the dynamic of competition always compels firms to transform their operations, to try to change how they're producing whatever their goods and services are, to cut costs, to develop new products, to develop new marketing strategies, all of which causes a continual turmoil in the labor market. Now, in order to secure employment for everyone, we, as a citizenry, have to step in. And we can't solve the problem by simply putting people to work doing the same kind of things that compete with profit-seeking enterprises, because that would only exacerbate the problems of overproduction. Instead, what has to be undertaken are public works, providing goods and services for the public that profit-seeking enterprises are neither willing nor able to provide. Now, I think it's not hard to think of all the things that we as a people are in need of. All of the infrastructure for clean energy, for wiring everyone with broadband services, for providing all of the care and services that we are lacking, for all of the help to educational institutions. There's no end, I think one can realize, to the kind of services that could be provided. Services, by the way, that have a human touch, that are very much robot-proof. And if you wonder how such an undertaking could be possible, I think you are aware that if something is actual, it is possible. Well, back in 1935, Franklin Delano Roosevelt undertook the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, and the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and put to work more than 8 million people, providing the greatest public goods that our country has seen. Great clean energy projects, huge amount of infrastructures, including 85,000 schools repaired and built, all sorts of libraries, all sorts of artistic ventures, all sorts of guidebooks. People of all different skills were put to work. And this was done when the United States had 130 million people, had an economy much smaller than it is today, and was suffering from its worst economic calamity ever. Now, we can renew such efforts, and I want you to think of how transformative it would be, of what a real rebirth of freedom it would represent. Imagine if every young person coming of age, whether they finished high school or are a dropout, could know that they will have a job at a living wage, providing goods and services for the common good. Imagine if everyone who is working knows that if they are downsized, if they are given part-time employment instead of full-time employment, that there is a full-time job awaiting for them at a living wage. Imagine if everyone coming back from the armed services knew that on return to this country, they would have a meaningful job awaiting for them at a living wage. And imagine what it would be like if everyone coming out of prison knew that there is awaiting them a legal manner of supporting themselves and their dependents, doing things for the common good. Now, this is very feasible. Under the New Deal, the infrastructure for these projects amounted to 1/3 of the cost of paying the labor. I would suggest that we should think of such an enforcement of the right to work as more or less setting a new national minimum wage. And I would like to suggest to you that we not be cheap, that we realize the full magnitude of the wealth accumulated in this nation and the magnitude of national income. And we should think about raising the floor to $20 an hour, which would be a national minimum wage of $41,600 per year. And it's very doable. It's very doable if you do the math. Our national wealth amounts to $90 trillion. If you divide that by the American population of 325 million people, you come to $280,000 per person. If you take the national income, it's close to $18 trillion per year. Divide that by our entire population, you come up with a per capita income of more than $50,000. Now remember that the labor force, the working force, is only about 156 million people. So there is plenty of wealth there to raise the floor to a level where people can actually support themselves and their dependents without being disadvantaged. And needless to say, those individuals who are unable to work because of disability deserve the same kind of replacement income. So I think if we think of this enforcement of the right to work, we're speaking of something that will have a fundamental significance in both going a long way to eliminating poverty and to eliminating the social disadvantage that plagues our efforts to make the American dream a reality. Now, Needless to say, the enforcement of the right to work does not solve all of our problems. One problem in particular it doesn't resolve is the discrepancy in power and opportunity between employer and employee. That difference is built into the very dynamics of the market. Competition requires firms to grow and hire more employees, take in more capital to be able to succeed in competing against other firms. So it's no accident that there are far fewer employers than there are employees. And that difference automatically indicates that the economic opportunities of employees are less than the economic opportunities of employers. Now, I'm not going to claim that the interests of employees are identical to what is good for the nation, any more than what is in the interests of employers is what is good for the nation. What is good for General Motors is not necessarily what is good for America. What is good for the United Auto Workers is not necessarily what is good for America. But we want to treat these particular interests as interests that should be treated on a par. And to do that, we have to take measures to remedy the imbalance between employee and employer. And I want to suggest two ways of addressing that. On the one hand, we need to transform the structure of corporations. Currently, employees have virtually no say in the decisions made by corporations. And now these corporations are making fateful decisions on what is going to happen to the full-time job. How is automation going to be handled? How is the transfer of production from one country to another going to be handled? How is the replacement of full-time jobs by part-time freelancers going to be handled? If we really want to remove the imbalance in power between employer and employee, we need to think of ensuring that the board of directors of every private and public corporation consists of at least 50% of the members of a board of directors be drawn from non-managerial employees elected by their peers. That way, employees would have a say and would have a decisive role to play in what will be the future shape of our economy. On the other hand, we also have to ensure that employees have more of an even hand in negotiating the conditions of their employment. Currently, the labor movement is at its lowest ebb. Less than 6% of private employees are unionized. And as union membership has declined, so has the share of wages in the national income. The share of wages in national wealth is at its lowest level ever. So what I want to suggest is that employers of multiple employees be required to engage in collective bargaining with the elected representatives of their employees. In that way, the bargain between employer and employee can take place on a much more even ground, where employees are no longer working in one big plantation, where the employer can say, take it or leave it. Now, needless to say, transforming the relations between employer and employee and guaranteeing employment to all is not going to be of much use if individuals cannot balance work and family. And I think, as we all know, the demands of caring for children and caring for elders can be so expensive, so time-consuming, that it's impossible for individuals to pursue work and take advantage of any employment opportunities they may have. So we have to deal with that. We have to take decisive measures to ensure that individuals can take care of their family rights and responsibilities while at the same time earning a decent living. And to do that, I want to suggest two types of remedies. On the one hand, employers, be they public or private, have to be required to give all employees, including part-time employees and freelancers, as well as full-time employees, 1 month paid vacation, as well as paid emergency family leave, as well as paid 9-month parental leave. In that way, employees will have some time that they can spend with their families and not find that doing so is unaffordable. On the other hand, we have to ensure that no one is unable to take advantage of daycare and elder care. And I think the best way of handling it is to make the same kind of commitment we made back in the 19th century concerning public education. It was decided that everyone would have an opportunity to go to school without any cost, without any means test that would stigmatize the poor. No, everyone would be offered the chance to have a public education at no cost. We need to do the same thing with regard to child care and elder care. We need to provide a system of public child care that is free, and we have to have equally a system of public elder care, because I think you all know how, as our population ages, the need to take care of the elderly can be something that is completely overwhelming when it's left to other family members. Now, in speaking about all of these measures, one thing that has to be kept in mind is to think of a fair way of how to finance these efforts. And I think we have to think about a completely different way of having fair taxation. One thing we have to keep in mind is that the inequality in wealth is far greater than the inequality in income. You know, we have accumulated more wealth than any nation in human history. As I mentioned, it comes close to $90 trillion. 85% of that wealth is in the hands of the 15% most affluent people. 25% of all Americans have zero or negative net worth. So there's a staggering amount of inequality in wealth that is much greater than the inequality in wages and salaries. In addition, when we have such unequal distribution of wealth, those who have the greatest amounts are simply unable to spend it. The wealth is kept locked up in investments. Whereas if instead some of that wealth is put to use, and put to use by providing employment opportunities to others, much more of the national wealth will be put back into the economy, producing a multiplier effect where it increases purchasing demand, investments in production, and growing employment. So in this respect, when we think about how to finance the public works that will guarantee everyone work at a living wage, how we're going to finance public daycare and elder care, how we're going to finance all the other measures that are key to using our economic opportunities, our social opportunities, we should think of a highly graduated wealth tax. Now, when I speak of a graduated wealth tax, what that means is that you start taxing people on wealth at a very small amount. In fact, there's really no need to even tax anyone who is below the median level of wealth. And instead, one can start with a very small amount. It could be 1/100% for those who have wealth of $500,000 to $1 million. Then from $1 million to $2 million, you raise it to 1%. From $2 million to 5%, you can raise it to 3%. And you increase the rate as you go higher and higher. Well, we can make it as high as necessary to fund all the programs that are required to ensure that we can all exercise our freedoms. Now, I didn't mention something else that obviously is a key, namely health care. And in this respect, the idea of a single-payer healthcare system of welfare for all has been put forward. But I think we need to think of it with one addition, namely that there be no deductibles, that there be no copays, that there be no charges for necessary medicines, that it cover all necessary physical, mental, and dental health care, and that it be paid for by a highly graduated wealth tax. This will allow everyone the greatest freedom in choosing your health care provider. It will also take the burden off enterprises of having to pay for some of the health costs of their employees. And it will be something that will finally allow health care to be a right. Now I want to point to one last measure that I've never heard anyone bring about, but I think it can be thought of exactly in terms of how healthcare can be best provided. And that is, in order to be able to exercise any of our freedoms, we have to be able to ensure that they are legally protected. And to do so, we have to have equal access to legal representation. Our Constitution provides us with the right to representation in criminal cases. But as we all know, the way that has been handled involves, on the one hand, legal aid arrangements where publicly funded lawyers ordinarily have huge caseloads, lack the resources to engage in investigations, and on the other hand, you have court-appointed lawyers who will not necessarily make that case the center of their interest and activity. There's something very unequal about that arrangement. And we are provided with no legal representation in civil cases. And civil cases are equally important, right? They have to deal with all of the harms we can suffer. They involve everything involving family disputes, custody arrangements, things pertaining to renting and owning property and so forth. Well, once again, we need to ensure that no one suffers from unequal legal representation in either criminal or civil cases owing to their differences in wealth. And we can do it by having a legal care for all. Exactly like we can have a Medicare for all. In other words, we have a single-payer insurance for all legal services. It can be paid for fully by a highly graduated wealth tax. And in this way, we can all avail ourselves of equal treatment before the law, which today we very much do not have. Now, these are the kind of proposals that I would like you to think about, that I would like you to demand that anyone who is to represent you stand for. And these are parts of a social Bill of Rights that I will be presenting and arguing for in the rest of this year and when I come out officially as a candidate. So, thank you.